Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hall, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Fallon Klug. She's the Director of Operations for That Sounds Fun Network, the podcast network that Annie F. Downs started with Kelly Haywood back in 2020. In today's episode, Fallon and I are going to talk about her start in production as a page for The Late Show with David Letterman, the benefits of being part of a podcast network, and then we even dive into growth strategies and podcast advertising. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Fallon Klug. Well, Fallon, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today.
Of course. Thank you so much for asking. I feel very honored.
So I heard about That Sounds Fun Network back when it started in 2020, because my wife, who is an avid That Sounds Fun listener, Annie's show, she's listened to pretty much every episode. And so when she was like, hey, they're starting a network and Annie's hiring this director of operations named Fallon, I was like, if I ever actually start my podcast, I should reach out and see if she would come on as a guest. So thank you for joining me.
Here we are. Yeah. We made it happen. Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, it's been an honor to be part of this team.
Yeah. So I saw on your LinkedIn that you've been in production for a while now, since 2012, when you worked as a page for The Late Show with David Letterman. So what was that like?
I did. Well, it sounds a lot more glamorous than it actually was. I mean, I had a blast. It was so much fun. But I'd say, they call it production. We worked in the audience department. Mm-hmm. So we were really in charge of handling all the audience members that came in. We would help host them, get them really energized and jazzed for the show, because Dave wants his audience members to be full of energy, which appropriately so. And so we were kind of in charge of just fielding cats a little bit, just making sure they knew the rules, they got in the right lines, they got in the right seats. And then we're just kind of part of the whole audience experience. So it was great. Met a lot of fun people, learned a lot at that job. And it was right at the end of his career. So I was there for the last year of his production of The Late Show, and it was a really special time to be there. And it was awesome. Really, really fun time in New York.
That's cool. Yeah. So after that, you did some other things. You worked at Mocha Club for a bit, and then you got hired on about a decade later to be the director of operations at the That Sounds Fun Network. So I'd love to hear your story about what led you to getting in and working with Annie and the That Sounds Fun Network.
Yeah. Well, as the Lord does, he had this planned way far in advance before I even had a glimpse that this was going to be a part of my future. So Annie and I actually met through the Mocha Club. So I worked there for 7 years. I worked in the kind of the community relations side of the ministry. But alongside that, I also worked with all of our artists that were partnered with that ministry to get the word out and, pitch it to people to get involved. And so Annie was one of those artists that I got to meet and work with. And so she used her platform to share about the Mocha Club, and we were in, communication as far as getting, all that set up and having that partnership. And so we met years and years ago. And so knew each other well through that ministry. And then I was actually still at Mocha Club and African Leadership at the time that I heard about the position at the network for the director of operations. And I had been, again, at African Leadership at that point for 7.5 years. Yeah. Loved it so much. Still a huge fan of their work and that ministry. But just felt like the Lord was kind of saying, I think it's time for a new adventure for you. And so funny enough, Annie reached out via email to me and a bunch of other work colleagues and said, hey, I started this network. I'm actually looking to hire a director of operations. Will you let me know if you have any friends that are interested in this position or would be a good fit? Little did she know I was in a season where I was kind of looking, and I read over the job description, keeping friends in mind, but also keeping myself in mind and being like, man, this kind of sounds like it could be a really fun fit. And so I emailed her back and said, hey, I actually have someone in mind, me. So I'm going to apply if that's okay. And she sent back a really sweet email and was just like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that you were even looking. This is the best news. Please apply and interview. We would love to meet with you. Kelly and I want to, meet in person with you and talk about this position. And so I went through the whole hiring position. I think there were 3 of us that kind of made the final round that they were deciding between. And they chose me, which has always been one of the biggest blessings. I love it so much that I've been able to be here. So it's been great. The network started in May of 2020 and I joined November of 2020. So really got to be on the front end of the network and build it and grow it. And it's just been an honor to be a part of this little startup business.
Yeah, nice. So as I was doing some research, I saw that when Annie started the network in 2020, one of the reasons was because she was feeling lonely in the work that she was doing. She was putting out a podcast and doing speaking stuff. And so how has the network been able to foster a collaborative community of podcasters and help fight that loneliness?
Yeah. You're a podcaster, you get it. You feel like it's you and the mic. It can be a really lonely place unless you have a team around you. And so Annie was feeling that and just felt like, man, I would love to build a community of people that kind of can support one another. And so that's one of the things we've been able to build here at the network is building that community and fostering, one another to learn from each other, support one another, talk about this crazy thing we're doing called podcasting that's weird and changing and still growing and still new. And it's really just a place where people feel like you get it. Like I'm around other people that understand what this work looks like. And as I'm asking questions, now I have a community that I can go to because it's not always like easy to just go to a friend and be like, hey, do you know what podcasting is? Do you know how to? And most people are like, yeah, I listen to them, but I'm not a podcaster. Yeah. So just to be able to, foster community that's in it, that's like doing the work together. And when we ask questions, we're all like, yeah, I'm asking that question too. Let's brainstorm and strategize about what that could look like. And so, it's been really cool to be able to have that community here at the network.
Nice. What have you found to be some of those common questions that podcasters on the network are bringing up?
Yeah. I think number one, and I think all podcasters will say this, how do I grow my show?
Yeah.
How do I reach more people? Whether it's for the point of, hey, I want to, make a business out of this. I want to make money. Or to the point of, I just want to make a bigger impact. Like I really believe in my show and I want more people to know about it. So how do I do that? So that's one of, the main things that we like to focus on here at the network is constantly educating ourselves. What are the new trends or the new practices or the new strategies in order to get the word out about your show? Yeah. And that's ever changing. I mean, podcasting, it's been around, but it's still a new, changing, morphing medium. And I think everyone's just like, hey, what have you tried? Oh, let me try that. And what may work for one podcast may not necessarily work for another. So really strategizing like, who is my audience? How is my show formatted? And what in turn is the best strategy in order to get more people in? So that's definitely the number one question we get. How do I grow my show?
Yeah, for sure. What have you seen as some of the biggest benefits for podcasters that are part of the That Sounds Fun network?
Yeah. I would say going back to the community, I think we pride ourselves on that being one of the biggest things, and that we hear our podcasters say is like, we just feel supported at the network. Like we just feel like we finally have people that get what we're doing or get the goals that we're trying to achieve. And we really feel supported either by the network, the staff here, or by other podcasters that are part of the network. And so that's been cool to have that be such a big goal, creating the network, and then seeing that that's really what people celebrate about being part of the network of like, oh yeah, we're all a little family here that gets to learn from one another and grow. And so, we're hoping that, the community aspect of it doesn't just stop there though, but that because there's a community of a lot of different shows and a lot of different content and a lot of different strategies that we're learning from one another, and in turn are answering that question of how do I grow my show? Oh, I have 16 other shows that I can look at and kind of see what they're doing and try those strategies and see if it works. So, I'm hoping we're doing what we say we want to do. But from the feedback we get from our podcasters, I think they're grateful to have this group.
Yeah. So let's get into the operations side of things for a little bit. What's your average week look like as a director of operations?
Yeah, Tim, that's a great question. I wish I could boil it down into these are my things that I do every time. But honestly, I feel like my role it's a lot of different hats that I put on. So one week looks really different from the week before. I would say overall, what my role is called to first and foremost is just to be the relationship kind of leader or facilitator between podcast host and their teams and our network. I want to make sure that whoever comes to our network feels seen, they feel supported, there's constant communication. If there's an issue that rises, there's a quick response. So I'm really called to fostering that relationship and just, at the end of the day, making sure they feel like the network is supporting them in all the ways that we can. And we have a team here of about 12. And so, we all have our different roles of how we do that. But I think my role is really kind of nurturing that friendship relationship and making sure their needs are met in whatever department that looks like. And then for our network team, I kind of oversee our team here in the office, just making sure, whatever department you're in, you feel supported by me, by your other coworkers. I lead our staff meetings. I make sure there's snacks in the kitchen. Everyone feels, like they're being fed well. Yeah. And just, again, fostering not only good relationships between our network and podcast hosts, but good relationships between our staff internally. So team building opportunities and I would say beyond that, more logistically speaking, like when new shows join our network, I facilitate kind of the onboarding process of that. I'm kind of like the first point of contact when a show is interested in a show, that I set up those meetings and kind of get an idea of, okay, what are your goals? What do you see a network helping with in those goals? And then from there, kind of working with our team to decide, hey, do we feel like we can serve this podcast well? And then once we onboard a show to our network, I, again, facilitate the whole onboarding process, making sure they have all our best practices and making sure they're on the right platforms in order to be most successful. So kind of the logistics behind what it takes to produce a good show. And then we have some seasonal shows that have joined us in the past that I've helped produce. So I kind of get my hat in a bunch of different areas, which I love. As long as I'm working with people, that's kind of my sweet spot. And so any way that I can do that, I'm happy about it.
Nice. So you just mentioned that you have an onboarding process. I'd love to hear more about what that looks like as you bring shows onto the network.
Yeah. So again, kind of our first meeting is just, again, me educating myself on your show. How did you hear about our network? What makes you excited about joining our network? What are your goals? How do you foresee a network serving you? And then I'm able to say like, yeah, we can do that for you. Or no, this might not be the best fit because of whatever reason. And so once we kind of have those meetings, it kind of goes into the contract negotiations. So I work with our legal team to set up those contracts and make sure everyone feels right and safe and supported on both ends. And then at that point, I pull in my team. My team is a part of kind of the vetting of like, do we feel like in each department we're able to serve whatever needs come up? And so once we've decided to bring on a show, again, kind of that onboarding list starts from like, okay, what platform are you on? Are you on the best platform? Do we need to move you over to a platform where our whole network can be on a platform together in order for the sales team to then sell across a network of shows versus just, one-off shows? And so, strategizing what, depending on the size of the show and the needs and, again, the goals, we kind of decide what's best for that. And then once, they're on the right platform, we start to audit the show and kind of see, okay, from production to formatting to your growth strategies to marketing, what are you doing? What's working? And what are the things that we would suggest that you do that maybe you aren't doing? And we start to implement those through our audit process. And then again, from there, most of our communication happens on Slack. We have, a dedicated channel for each show on our network. So we're in constant communication. So our sales team is throwing out brands that are possible partners for a show, and those are getting approved by the host. And I'm chiming in, making sure, hey, are you feeling supported this week? Is there anything you need? Or if they hit a fun milestone of downloads or the amount of episodes they put out, we send them a little like, hey, did you know that today you hit 1 million downloads? That is huge. Let's celebrate that. And then, we've had Anthony, our engineer here, do audits of the production quality of all our shows. So if he has any suggestions, he's listening in on shows and always, wanting our shows to sound best. So giving, helpful hints here and there. So it's just a constant, like, the podcaster's no longer alone. Even if they have their own team, like, we feel a part of their team now and are just constantly supporting and educating and being here to answer questions that they have too. So that's kind of how it looks.
Yeah, nice. So what do you look for before that onboarding process as people are approaching you? What are you looking for, and how do you best align what the values are for the network and new shows that might be interested in joining?
Yeah. First and foremost, we would say that as a network, we want to encourage and put out impactful, purposeful, positive, good content. It doesn't mean it has to be happy, fun, joyful content all the time. We have some shows on our network that episodes can get really hard and deep, and it's not always fun and bubbly, but at the end of the day, if we can put out impactful and purposeful shows, that's what we're about. There's enough noise out in the world, enough, just ugly and scary and crazy news that is happening. And if we can just kind of be a light in all that noise and encourage people wherever they're at, that's our big goal. It's been said many times throughout the podcast industry that people come to a podcast to learn something, to be entertained, or to better themselves. Yep. And so if we're hitting on those three things in some sort of capacity, or if we see a show that does at least one of those three things, again, in a helpful, positive way, then it's something that we're interested in. And then again, it goes back to the show's goals. Like, if a show comes to us and says, hey, we really want to monetize, that's our number one goal. Well, then our question is, what is your audience size? Because that's really going to determine if you're able to make money on your show and if the platform you're on has those capabilities to have those revenue models. And so that's something we can take into consideration if you're coming to our network and you just want to make money, which is fine. Sometimes that is the goal. And if it's your business, great. We want to make sure that we can do that for you. And we'll be honest and say, hey, at these numbers, this is what you can expect. And so what we can do to best serve you is give you some appropriate goals to reach for if you do want to monetize, and then come back to us and we'll be able to help you at that point. Then other shows will come to us and say, hey, monetization really isn't the goal. If that's an added bonus, great, but I'm really looking to grow. I really feel confident in my content and I'm just really looking for marketing and growth opportunities. Then obviously that's a separate conversation. There's a constant check of capacity on our team. Like, okay, we're currently serving 17 plus shows. Do we feel like we're all serving them appropriately? When do we need to take a pause and not onboard shows for a couple months? Because we don't just want to do bigger just for the sake of numbers. Like, we want to do quality service here at the network. And so just constantly kind of vetting ourselves in that way to make sure that's happening before we onboard new shows is super important. So yeah, again, it goes back to what are your goals? We're always open to conversations and seeing how we can serve you, but it's really based on what are your goals and how can we serve that, if at all.
Yeah. So I think I've heard that you do quarterly meetings with the podcast hosts on the network. And so I'd love to hear about what those meetings look like. What do you guys talk about? How do you prepare for those? All of that kind of thing.
Yeah. So quarterly meetings, again, are a way to commit to our promise of building a community. And so it's a way for all of the shows in our network to come together on Zoom or in person once a quarter. And it's for 1 hour. And we take that time again to just have a place where we're all together, having a time to hang. But more than that, it gives us an opportunity to educate our podcasters. That's another big thing here at the network that we highly value is we want to take the work of being educated ourselves on the podcast medium as it constantly grows and shifts and gets bigger. And it's a lot of work to know exactly what's going on all the time. And so if we can kind of be the experts there and in turn educate our hosts and their teams, on what's changing and what's new to try, that's what we want to do. We want to help shows grow. And so a big part of the quarterly roundtables is an education piece of whether it's, hey, this hour, this quarter, we're going to talk about the top 10 growth strategies we want you to try for the next couple months. Or last year, our team went to Podcast Movement in Denver, and you go to a 4-day conference and you come back with your brain is fried, but also you have a long list of like all these things you've learned. And not all of our podcast hosts can go to conferences like that. And so we've taken these quarterly roundtables to say, okay, we just got back from Podcast Movement. These are the things we learned that we really want you guys to know, to implement, ask questions, again, just educating as best we can. So yeah, each quarter looks a little different, but at the end of the day, if we feel like our teams walked away feeling like, man, that was so fun to be part of a community and I learned so much that I want to use in my podcast, then we call that a success.
Yeah, that's really cool. So what would you say if podcasters are trying to figure out, okay, what stats should I be paying attention to and which ones are just vanity metrics? What should I be looking at? I've got some ideas, but I'd love to hear what you look at.
Yeah. So downloads, it's a funny one because, depending on what platform you're on or what you're looking at measurement wise, it can be a little different. So luckily there is that IAB certification measurement that, the podcast industry uses to make sure everyone's kind of reporting the same. But again, with technology, with Apple's iOS 17 update, that put a change in the way downloads were reported. And so downloads at the end of the day is important because it's what advertisers use to sell a show. It's just the metric they use. So as imperfect or not quite as perfect as hopefully it will be in the future, it is the metric that is used. So we all kind of got to pay attention to it. So definitely downloads is something we use. We have a whole internal sales team. So that's what they need to know in order to know how to sell your show. Beyond that, I would say the other important metrics we follow are listener consumption rates. Yep. So how long is a listener actually engaged in your show? Where are those drop-off points? Why are they dropping off? Is it because there's an ad there? Okay, that's typical, but is it because the content isn't what they expected from the title? Isn't what they expected from your show description? Is your show too long? Do you need to shorten it up? Is your show too short and actually people are engaged 100% of the time? Maybe you can make it even longer and open up more inventory if you do want to sell your show. So the consumption rate is definitely another one we look at. And then obviously demographics, like listener demographics are always helpful to know, especially if you're looking to sell your show and you want to utilize dynamic ads where it's targeted per location. You want to know who your audience is, where they're listening, what time of day. Obviously, that also speaks into marketing. When are your listeners engaging in your content? How does that align with when you put out a newsletter or when you post on socials? So, yeah, I think that's a handful of kind of what we look at. But again, I'm constantly in my email inbox reading newsletters from Pod News and Podcast News Daily and Sounds Profitable. And there's always something I learned from those. Even the other day, I learned about a new metric of listener churn and how, listeners fall off and how you want to be tracking that. And so, I'm constantly learning beyond downloads, there are some really other significant metrics that are important to look at, even though downloads kind of seems to be the king because it's where, money is based on. But if you want to know really who your audience is, you got to look beyond the downloads and look at, the listener behavior.
Yeah. Do you use the listener number that you get with the IAB stats as well as part of that way that you balance? Because downloads doesn't really tell you a whole lot besides that somebody engaged for whatever, the standard is.
Yeah, we both look at Apple Podcast Connect and Spotify analytics just to see month over month, is your followership, is your listenership growing? And if it is, that's really promising. Also beyond that, not just if you press follow, but who is actually listening, who has actually pressed play on the show. If that's growing, that's awesome. Both if your followership and your listenership is growing, it's positive. Whatever marketing efforts you're putting out there, more people are learning about your show. So that's something that we would encourage you to keep doing. If we're seeing those numbers drop, then we ask ourselves why. Why aren't people engaging as much? Did the cadence of your release schedule change? Did the content change? Does it not match what it used to be? Which is not bad. Sometimes in podcasting, you need to try new things. And I would actually encourage podcasters, if something's not working, don't be scared to try out a new format or try out new music or a new intro or a new title description that might fit better to actually what you want to put out there. So yeah, it's a constant hey, let's try this. Let's test it. Okay, how'd that go? All right, let's try this. Let's test it. Okay, how did that go? And it's fun. It's fun that podcasting allows you to kind of have that freedom. And we say this all the time. Podcasting is a long game. So you got to be committed to, after 6 months, if you're well, I don't have that many listeners, you've only been doing it for 6 months. We tell our shows at least give it a year if you're a brand new show to really see how you feel about this medium, how your audience has engaged with your content, because you can't know in less than a year. You really got to give it time. And so we definitely encourage shows, hey, be committed. And going back to your question of what is something we look for in shows that want to join the network, we really look for that commitment. We're not looking for shows that are just I just kind of want to try podcasts because it sounds fun. We're no, we want this to be your priority, whether it's one of the top tiers of your business or a significant part. It's got to be a priority because you can't go into podcasting, half energized about it. You got to be really committed to how much work it takes. Because I think it is surprising when people come into podcasting who's never done it before that it's man, this is a lot of work. I didn't realize how much work goes into this, which obviously, Tim, it is a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And so I think just having a realistic expectation and just idea about what this looks like. We try to educate new shows that come to us, we say like, hey, this is what it looks like. And so if you're aware of that and it's making you excited and you're like, oh yeah, I'm in this, like I'm going to put my all into it, then that gets us excited. Because as much as our network is committed to shows, we need that same commitment from shows to the partnership with our network too. So,
yeah, I mean, when I worked at Ramsey Solutions as the producer for the Entree Leadership podcast, it was my full-time job. Like there was a lot that goes into it, from coming up with ideas and booking guests and looking at the stats. 100%. I mean, I love to dig into the stats and figure out different ways to analyze them and figure out, I mean, one of the fun things that I got an opportunity to do was like, okay, we have all this data. How can we use it together and try and figure out, like, because you don't have the same account-based stats that you do with like social media, for example. Like, how can you figure out how much time per listener people are spending with your show or stuff like that? It's like, you just try and do different things. So it's a lot of fun. But yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into it that people don't realize.
There's so much work.
And when I would tell people, I'm a podcast producer, like, oh, that sounds cool. I'm like, what does that mean? It's like, it means a lot of things, actually.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, Tim, are there any like metrics or analytics I didn't mention that you track that you find really important?
Yeah. So you're talking about both, downloads and then, average time listen. So as you know, Apple and Spotify give us that information to some usable extent.
Right.
It's not fantastic, but at least it gives you an idea of, okay, here's the drop off on the show. And then the other one that I've used as well, and that has kind of been what you're talking about with the iOS 17 update, that the downloads dropped because of a refinement, which is a good thing for the industry, not a great thing for people that are using it to make money, because then you have a deflation of what was overinflated, basically. And so the number that gets you closer to that I'm interested to see how it develops is your unique listener number.
Yes.
And so different platforms call it different things. But basically, it's the granular part of like, okay, this IP address with this user agent downloaded this episode, and they count as one person, even though they may have downloaded 3 episodes when they did that.
Right.
And so there's something there that is good to keep track of, that I just like
100%.
When I'm looking at my show. Okay, what's the difference between unique listener number and the downloads, and why is there a difference, and how is that going to change over time, and how much value should we be putting in one number or the other? And so
we're even seeing that when it comes to monetization, because if an ad is baked in, a download counts, versus if it's inserted dynamically, it only counts if it's actually listened to, because with that technology, they're able to see, oh, this was actually listened to or it wasn't. And so we're starting to see that shift of getting more accurate. So I am also curious, like, is the download number ever going to kind of go by the wayside, and it's really going to turn into the unique listener number that people start to utilize for that kind of thing?
Yeah, and that's the great part about podcasting, and also its downfall. Like, you don't have an account-based anything. Because it's so open. It's just like, that's the closest thing we've got is like this listener number. So I'm interested too, because since you just brought this up, is there a advertising strategy that you have found to work better than the other with dynamic versus baked in?
Yeah. So we're actually starting, this year was our goal to kind of, historically, we have always done baked in host read. Like that has been kind of the meat of how we sell. Our sales team comes with years of experience. Heather, our head of partnerships and advertising, used to work for another network. Obviously, she now works for us. She just comes with so much experience and expertise when it comes to this stuff. So she would say, I think historically, the host read baked in has always kind of been king. And now with new technology coming out and being able to insert dynamically, where it's more of a radio or a TV ad, where, you're really focusing those ads on demographics, location, audience makeup, it makes more sense. Like
really
you're
does.
diving more into the consumer that would be interested in hearing this ad. And so that's something that we've had to change the hosting platform and the technology we use in order to utilize those capabilities, because there's some platforms that they haven't opened up that capability yet. And so we've had to adjust a lot of our shows in order to move to a platform that does so. And so we're doing both now. We're doing host read, baked in, and dynamic, either host read or pre-produced. And we're kind of in that learning curve right now of seeing what are the benefits of both, which one kind of seems to out-tier the other. I think forever will probably be both. I don't foresee us ever going away from embedded, baked-in ads and going strictly dynamic. I say that, who knows in 5 years if that'll totally change. But I think we have found a sweet spot of being able to utilize kind of all that's available. And different brands want different things.
Right.
Some brands come to us and they want the ad to live in forever and ever and ever. And some brands want to be more specific to the consumer that listens to it. And so dynamic makes more sense for them. And so it is cool that we get to work with brands and say, hey, we can do it all.
Right.
Like, you let us know what you're interested in. And then obviously we get full approval from all the shows we work with. So they get a say in it too of like, hey, I only want to have brands on my show that I personally am endorsing.
Exactly, yeah.
I don't want to do programmatic ads where I don't necessarily know what ad's going to be played. I know what category, but I don't necessarily know what ad. So I would say I don't know what the future holds in that, but I do think it's a sweet spot now to be able to utilize all of it and kind of, keep a running list in our heads of like, this is what we love or hear about baked in. This is what we love or hear about dynamic, and not have to throw one or the other away, but kind of utilize the best of both.
Yeah. And I even recommend to clients that I work with, if they have the option to do dynamic ads, you can still do baked in ads with dynamic ads.
Totally.
And the great part about that is then if you change your strategy later, you can update them all instead of having to go back and like, okay, now I got to go find all these files and how do I edit this out or what do I do?
Right. And hopefully now technology is coming out where if you're on a platform, like the technology can find those ad placements versus, cool having to track down the timestamp. And so we're hoping that that comes around sooner rather than later, because it is a lot of work to have to go back and reinsert ad markers if you want to get rid of a baked in ad. And so, come on, industry, help us out here.
Yeah, there's some platforms. The one I use is Captivate, and they do have an ad replacement tool, which is great. But you still have to know where the ads are and you still have to go find them.
Totally.
Like, there's still the work that to be done, but it is great that some platforms are starting to do more of that kind of stuff because there is a need for that.
Right.
So I like to circle back to some of the stuff that you were saying before with, a lot of the shows that come to the network are looking to grow. And so what have you found, now that you've worked with so many different shows, what have you found to be the best strategies for growing a podcast?
Yeah. When we think about that, we constantly go back to the thought of it's way easier to convert a podcast listener to a new podcast versus a non-podcast listener to now be a podcast listener. And so because of that, kind of the strategies that we found really helpful are cross promos. So anytime that you can just air an ad about another podcast on your podcast, hey, you already are talking to a podcast listener. Right. So in some regard, they're going to be interested in hearing about another podcast. Most podcast listeners don't listen to just one show. They typically listen to 5 or 10 shows. And so utilizing that desire already or that demographic and also being a part of a network, we get the intel of who each audience is on our shows. And so we can start to match up those audience demographics between 2 shows and say, hey, your demographic on this show looks very similar to this demographic. In turn, those audiences might like each other's shows if they've never heard of it. Let's do some cross-promoting. So that's definitely one of them. Both inside and outside of the network, we utilize cross-promotions. And then we always encourage our hosts as much as they can to be guests on other podcast shows. Again, if you're a podcaster, you want to be talking to other podcast listeners. So the best way to do that is to be on another show. And I think you know this, Tim, and us two being on this call is an example of this. The podcast community is so encouraging and supportive of one another. Like, there's not much competition. I mean, maybe like, behind the scenes, there's a little bit of like, oh, that show does what we do. I'm curious what they're doing so we can maybe grow to their size. But at the end of the day, I really do think podcasters just want this medium to be successful in whatever that looks like. And so people are really open to having other podcast guests on their show and doing swaps that way. And whether, you do a swap where you match an impression goal and you both commit to that, or you pay a little bit of an advertising fee, like people are very open to partnering when it comes to podcasting, which I think is so fun. Like, I just think that's awesome that we have a medium that does that. It's less competition and more community. So being a guest on other shows. And then we've learned that one of the top ways that a podcaster has their show heard by a new listener is by word of mouth. So a big call to action that we encourage our shows to share is just ask your people to share about your show. Like, podcast listeners are very big fans of the podcast shows they love, they're not scared to tell about the show. Like they want to have other listeners like kind of have this like fun connection of, oh, you like the show? I like the show too. Did you listen to this episode? This was so great. And so I think just reminding podcast host, hey, just ask your people to be advocates for you. A, they're going to be the best advocates because they're already big fans. Right. So there's not much you have to do there to like talk them into sharing. They love you. But just to remind them like, hey, would you take 1 minute and text this episode to a friend if you loved it? Or, would you share this post on our Instagram about our show? And, whether you attach a incentive to that or a giveaway, that's great. But I think sometimes podcast hosts are scared to ask people to, chat about their likeness for a show. And it's just like, no, because podcasting is a free medium, for the most part, unless you're behind a paywall, Patreon or something. I think listeners feel indebted to like, you've given me a free product for 100+ episodes. The least I can do is share it with a friend. If that's the one thing we're asking, I think listeners would be willing to do so. So that's definitely something we keep in mind all the time is word of mouth is so important. Let's make sure we're asking our people to be a part of this growth. So yeah. And I think at the end of the day, you got to figure out as far as it comes to marketing, like some people will say be on every platform available because you're just opening up your show to all audiences. Depending on the size of your team, that just might be viable.
Exactly.
Like it just, if I'm a one-man show, I can't be on 5 different social media platforms thinking that I'm doing the best on all. So maybe that looks like what are the top 2 or maybe just the top 1 social media that I feel like really encapsulates the audience that either I currently have or the audience that I want. And let me, go all in on that and put all my efforts into that one thing and kind of see the result. And then you can start to A/B test. Hey, did that not work? Okay, maybe I do need to shift over to another social media platform and try it out there. But yeah, I think, again, you got to think about the content of your show, the team you have, and the goals at the end of the day are really going to decide what you do as far as promoting and growing and whatnot.
Yeah. I was asking Dave Ramsey a similar question about podcast growth because they hit number 1 all categories not too long ago. And word of mouth was one that he was like, we've been doing the show for 30 years and we just started deciding, hey, every episode we're going to ask them to share. And what did they do? They shared the episode and more people listened. And that was one of the key metrics that he gave as that's how we got to be number 1.
Right.
And so that's cool to hear too, that's just a solid way to get the word out. And it is, as a podcaster, you're like, I'm doing this thing, I like it, but I feel weird about asking people to also like share it, but just ask them.
Sure,
like you're saying, they're dedicated to showing up and spending time with you.
Yes.
And they probably will share if you ask them. And they might not be thinking about it. Oh yeah, I should share this with a friend. But if you ask, they might.
Totally. And I think just being very transparent of like, hey, listeners, the only way that the show grows is if we talk about it. So I really need your help. Like, I think because the audio connection feels pretty intimate, like you're in their ears, like physically you're in their ears. So I think just being able to be honest with them and transparent is really valuable when it comes to podcasting. I mean, even like if you're in an interview and for some reason you're not excited about the topic, the listener hears that. Like, you can't fake a lot in podcasting. Like it's either real or people are like, nah, I hear you. I can sense something's off. So anyways, all that to say, just being honest and transparent with your listeners and then just asking them, hey, I need your help. Would you mind doing it? 9 times out of 10, a listener's like, happy to help, happy to press 5 stars on a rating, happy to put in a little review. Like people want to help. So just got to ask.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So another thing that I'm curious about is advertising and how a network helps different podcasters work together. I kind of have an idea of how this all works, but I'd love to hear how you guys do this and what the workflow looks like of connecting advertisers with different shows. And if you're willing to share like what the revenue split is, how that all works.
So Ryan and Heather and Tarek are part of our sales team. So all 3 of them come from years of experience, just already having a relationship with brands in different capacities. And so we work both with direct sales. So we have direct relationships with certain brands. And then we also partner with agencies that, have a slate of brands that we can go to one agency and work with maybe 10 brands because they're all part of this one agency. So we work with both. Both have their benefits, both have their drawbacks. And then once Heather or Ryan or Tark establish that relationship, they're obviously able to bring the network shows to them. So we say, hey, this is our whole media kit of 17 shows. Here are a couple I think might work for your brand, but check out the whole media kit. Let us know what you're interested in. And then from there, once a brand is interested, that's where the approval process with our podcast host begins. So we never book anything on any of our shows without the strict approval from our hosts. And that most often includes that they try out the product before they even commit to a brand. A lot of the brands we bring them, they're already using it or working with them in some capacity, because when we do start a relationship with a show on the network, we give them a form that says, hey, here are the list of brands we currently work with. Who are you familiar with? Who are you interested in? And also, what are products that you currently use, services that you use every day that maybe aren't on this list, but that we could approach? Because I mean, there's so many brands and products out there. We can't hit them all. And so we're always interested in learning what our podcasters use. And then that can always be, an entry point to, oh, we've never worked with Dove before, but you love Dove soap. Let me see if I can either work with this agency that might have a contact or do, some research and try to find a contact there and start that relationship. So that approval process is super important. And some, hosts will say, hey, thanks for bringing me that brand. I don't think it's a good fit, not interested. Totally fine. Yeah. Then we won't move forward with that. We always want to make sure that the hosts feel comfortable with whatever they're sharing and genuine. Again, their listeners going to know if a, ad is genuine or not. And I also think listeners understand that because the RSS feed is a free, ecosystem, it's got to take something in order to keep podcasters doing what they're doing. And so listening to a 30-second or 60-second ad is, I think, an okay thing to ask a listener to do. They can always skip, of course, but I think now, because those ads and podcast shows are so popular, people, expect, oh yeah, there's going to be an ad in this show. That's totally fine.
Right.
So anyways, that's kind of how it works. And then everything is just based on a revenue split. So any revenue made from those ads, we just split it between the network and a show. Again, those splits are dependent on how much of a show needs our support as a team.
Sure. Okay.
As I said before, sometimes shows come to us and say, hey, we just want monetization. We don't need anything else. We don't need marketing help. We don't need production help. We don't need brand advisement. We don't need anything. Literally, we just need a sales team. Obviously, that split's going to look a little different than if another show comes to us and says, hey, we need this and this and this. We need to revamp our whole brand. We need your graphic designer on that. We need marketing help. We need to switch platforms and we need advisement on that. Obviously, that's going to take a lot more of our team. So the split will look different that way. So we try to cater our partnerships. We don't try to do a one size fits all, but hey, how can we really best serve you and listen closely to those goals and needs and then base an appropriate relationship off of that?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. All right, we're about to go into the high pass segment, but before we do, I'd love to know from one podcaster to another, what's your biggest pet peeve in podcasting right now?
I would probably say something we chatted about before is podcasters not being committed to the medium. It really frustrates me when I hear someone be like, yeah, I tried podcasting, but I didn't really grow an audience. It just wasn't a fit. And I felt like I failed. And I was like, well, how long did you do it for? And it was like 3 or 4 months. And I was like, okay, well, let's talk about this. I really am blown away and encouraged by people that say, hey, no matter what my numbers are, obviously I'm going to pay attention to them, but I'm committed to this for at least a year. I'm going to put my all into it. I'm going to perfect it as much as I can. I'm going to be okay to change things if I feel like I need to format something different, or even the content. Okay, I thought going into this podcast, the content was going to be this. I'm actually finding out I like this a little bit more. So I'm going to shift it a little bit to this over here. And so that commitment level for me, if it's not there, can be really frustrating, because I think people walk away from podcasting being like, that sucked. I didn't like that. Podcasting is not fun. And it's like, no, you just didn't give it enough time. It really can be a really successful, impactful medium if you got to give it that time and commitment. So I would say that's my biggest pet peeve. What's yours?
That's definitely one of them. I think for me, just being an audio professional is quality too.
Yes.
Because you might come across another show and be like, oh, yeah, maybe I'll check this out. And you hit play and immediately it's like, you recorded this on your phone or something in the bathroom?
Right.
Why does it sound awful?
Right.
So it's like
right.
just being intentional about where you're recording And I was talking with the hosts of the Bema podcast, and Brent was saying the simplest thing you can do is just record in your bedroom. It's not going to cost anymore, but it will sound better. So just do it.
Put up a couple sheets.
Yeah.
It'll be great.
So
yeah.
The quality is probably the biggest one for me. And then consistency is another thing. And, I tell people too that you got to choose a frequency that you can sustain. And so with that in mind, like, I'm going to do this for a year. What can I sustain? And if I can't sustain bi-weekly or more, maybe podcasting isn't right for you right now.
Right.
Because doing something monthly isn't super effective, or less than that would not be advisable. So then a season might be a better choice,
Right.
So
good.
That's great stuff. All right. So the high pass segment, we'll jump in there where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So the first one, you used to be a co-host of a show about snacks called The Snack Show. So what is your current favorite snack?
Oh, my current favorite snack. Oh, Tim, you can't ask a snacker what their current favorite snack is. I'm like, what are the things I've been snacking on recently? I would say, so I'm kind of in this protein kick where I'm just trying to get more protein into my life. So because of that, I came across, now this is going to sound like they're a sponsor of the show. They are not. This is totally a genuine advertisement. They're called Mosh bars.
Okay.
Have you heard of them?
No.
MOSH, Mosh bars. And they're protein bars, but not only protein, they have like lion's mane and ashwagandha also in it. So it's a very like brain-fueled protein bar. Okay, to be fair, they were an ad on That Sounds Fun podcast. So that's how I heard about them. But me personally, I am not being paid. So I tried a couple of their flavors. I will say I'm a huge peanut butter lover. Huge peanut butter lover. Their peanut butter was my favorite. It felt like it tasted a little chemically, like fake peanut butter, you know what I'm saying? But they have 2 other flavors called cookies and cream and a cookie dough protein bar. And those are fire. So I currently have one sitting on my desk. I bought a 12-pack. I'm obsessed. So yeah. Mosh bars. Shout out.
Nice. Mm-hmm. All right. What is one of your favorite stories from a listener about how a show on the network has impacted their life?
I don't know if I can pick out one story, but we have, you're familiar with Chartable. Mm-hmm. We have our Chartable connected to our Slack. So anytime a review comes in, it kind of gives us like a summary of like this week's reviews. And then on Slack, we can kind of read them all.
Nice.
And some days I'll just like go through it and just read about all our different shows. And it's just so encouraging how much these shows are loved. Like, and for people to take the time to like write out how much they love a show or how much it's impacted them or whatever. And I think what I read most when I read through those of, again, going back to were they entertained? Did they learn something? Did they better themselves? I feel like the better themselves is the one I come across where listeners just feel like after listening to your show, I just feel better. Like I either learned something that like impacted me positively or I was just feeling down and I needed to laugh, whatever it is. I feel like people just appreciate like, hey, because I listened to the show, I'm a better person today for whatever reason. And so I love just knowing that we've created a network where people feel that way. And obviously it's encouraging for a host. Like you and I both know podcasting is hard and we get in slumps where we feel like, oh my gosh, I just need a break from this. This is so hard. But when you read stuff like that, it kind of reminds you, okay, the why behind this is evident because my listeners are feeling a certain way. And if anything, if that's the only positive of putting out a podcast, I think that's pretty powerful. Yeah. I mean, if you're impacting people's lives just because they listen to something you have to say, that's huge. That's really huge. So yeah, I'm really appreciative of reviews. So I will say this, if you love a podcast, give them a review because it's not just because it opens up the show to more listenership. It really is a direct communication to a podcast host and they read them. Like they read them and they take them to heart and it informs how they produce content moving forward. And so please leave reviews. They're very important.
All right. Last question. What's your favorite ministry podcast to listen to? Or what is your favorite ministry that you wish had a podcast?
This might be cheating, but it's honest. So Annie put out a podcast a couple of years ago called Let's Read the Gospel.
Yeah.
And it's a daily gospel reading. So each month you're reading through all 4 Gospels. And I listened to it from January 1st to December 31st. Not to brag, but I was very committed to it. And that was a super impactful show for me. Just to be able to be in the Word that consistently every day, and then it be in some ways repetitive every month. Yeah. So you're being reminded of like, oh, I've heard this before, but because of this translation, I'm hearing it with fresh ears. I don't know. It really did something for me. So I have to say a big thank you to Annie and her team for putting that together. Because, I mean, reading the Gospels every day, that is a lot of work. They put in so much work. And so that was a really huge blessing for me that past year. And then this year, I'd never listened to the show before, but I started listening to the Bible recap.
Yeah.
So again, a way to get into the Word every day has been really helpful. And Tara Lee Cobble's episodes are not super long. They're 6 minutes. So I listen to them on my drive to the gym. And to be transparent, you're supposed to like read the verse and then listen to her podcast. And I don't even read the verse. I just like listen to like her notes of the day. And I just think it's, for me personally, for my faith walk, it's been just good to have some sort of gospel entering into my brain every day. So that's been great. So 2 great shows to check out for sure.
Yeah, my wife listened to, why am I forgetting the title? The one you just mentioned.
Let's Read the Gospels or Bible Recap?
So we've done both. Okay. Last year she did the Let's Read the Gospels. And then this year we're also doing Bible Recap. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
We're on the same trajectory. I love it.
So I'm
I love it.
Days and days behind at this point, but that's okay.
It's fine. She says it's okay. It is okay. And every episode she's like, if you're behind, it's fine.
I just don't like the feeling of scrolling back.
You're right. I get it.
But I've said to myself, I'm just going to keep checking them off. And if you don't read every day, it's okay. Just keep going.
Hey, Tim, just think about me. I'm not reading at all. I'm just taking the easy road. I'm just listening. So if you're doing more than that, you're doing a great job.
That's great. All right. So to close today's episode, if a podcaster is thinking about joining a podcast network, what is one piece of advice that you would give them?
I would say make sure that you're committed to doing this. Whether or not you have a network partnership, I think you got to be committed to doing it. And I don't think you should rely on a network being the yes or no on if you do a podcast. Like, I think you should be really convicted in a positive way of like, hey, I really want to try this. You don't have to be partner with a network to be successful. Yes, it's helpful if you're looking for a team. If you don't have a sales team and you need connections, yes, that's helpful. But especially if you're new starting out, you can do it just on your own. Both equipment, both the platforms that we use, very easy to access. Some are free even if they're not, on the cheaper side. And so I would say be committed to doing it, no matter if you get a yes or no from a network. And then be very clear about what you're looking for in a network. Like, be very clear when you come to a network that you have a list of goals and you have an idea of why you want to partner with a network. Like, how do you foresee a network helping with that? And that's okay if you don't know what a network offers. Honestly, if you do a little bit of research, you'll learn a lot. But at least have some goals that you can list out and say, this is really what I want to do. This is where I think I need help. I don't know if a network can help with this, but this is where I need help. And then obviously in those conversations, you can figure out, if they offer those services to those specific needs. So be committed and then come with some clear goals and give it your all.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, Fallon, thank you for taking the time today. I really appreciate our conversation and getting to hear about the work that you get to do at That Sounds Fun Network. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your podcast. This is cool to be able to talk to other people in this crazy world of podcasting. And I appreciate you asking.
Well, it was a lot of fun getting to talk with Fallon and hearing about the great work that she and the team at That Sounds Fun Network produce. I always love getting to talk shop with other podcast professionals and hearing the impact that they're making on their listeners. And hearing Fallon's biggest pet peeve in podcasting right now, that podcasters aren't committing to the medium, is a struggle for so many people. But you really do have to play the long game and commit to publishing for about a year, which is why podcasting isn't for everyone. Now, I enjoyed hearing Fallon's pet peeve in podcasting right now, but what is yours? Let me know by sending me a message or tagging me on social media. You can listen to podcasts from That Sounds Fun Network with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, text it to a friend or share it on social media. Together, we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. And if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on the next one. And leave a 5-star review while you're at it. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Jason Romano. He's the Director of Media for Sports Spectrum and the host of Sports Spectrum Podcast. Jason and I are going to talk about his leap of faith from a nearly 17-year career with ESPN to pursuing sports ministry, how their magazine, website, and podcast work together in their content strategy, and what it takes to book a dozen or more interviews each and every month. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.